Well, good morning, folks, and welcome to Tuesday at Lakeside for Faith for Living. And it's good to see everybody here this morning. We have Dr. Somerville's books here, When the Sandcastle Crumbles, and the 7 First Words of Christ, which are going fast. And so make sure you get those if you want them. And we'll have a book, is ready to do a book signing after the... Okay, after Faith for Living. We'll go around to Green Gables, which is right around the corner here for book signing at 10 o'clock. And then our seminar is at 11 o'clock with Greg Linville up at the train station. And he'll be talking about Eric Liddell today and more about his life. And if you were here last night for the movie, you saw a lot about Eric Liddell, of course, but he went on to be a missionary in China, and then he'll conclude about his life, which is quite interesting and quite, well, I don't want to do a spoiler alert, so you just need to come at 11 o'clock and learn about the rest of the story about Eric Liddell. Tonight is Vespers at the gazebo, or the bandstand as we call it, and it is a bit windy, but it's going to be sunny and beautiful down there, so we'll plan on that at 7 o'clock. And Dr. Somerville will be bringing our message. We're looking forward to that. And tomorrow will be, of course, day 3. And we welcome the pastors who are here for the pastors' retreat. And tomorrow we'll have, at the conclusion of the Faith for Living, communion with the pastors as they depart and go back to the service in their local communities. So I don't want to take any of his time away from him. So would you welcome this morning Dr. Jim Somerville from Richmond, Virginia.
Thanks very much, Charlie. Glad to be with you again on what feels like a chilly morning to somebody who was born in Alabama. This feels refreshing and wonderful. And my wife, Christy, is with me today and also in the room. If you're looking for her, she's right back there waving her hat. And she may have heard some of these stories before, but she came back anyway, and so did you. Thank you very much. I'm going to keep my jacket on a minute longer because it advertises a project I started about 10 years ago called A Sermon for Every Sunday. I was in a trustee meeting at a seminary, and they were talking about how they just can't seem to produce enough pastors to fill all the vacant pulpits in America. And I thought, well, what somebody needs to do is to record video sermons of America's best preachers so that little groups of people can get together, they can sing some hymns, they can say some prayers, they can read some scripture, and when it's time for the sermon, they can push a button. And one of America's best preachers will pop up on the screen to deliver a sermon based on the lectionary passage for that day. So I started that 10 years ago, and we have produced hundreds of video sermons by some of America's very best preachers. But if you go to that website, A Sermon for Every Sunday, you can find what's there. This week we have 3 different sermons based on the lectionary passages for this coming Sunday. So yeah, if you needed a supply preacher someday and couldn't find one, you can push a button and project it on a screen. We give those sermons away free of charge. And I get letters from people in the Yukon Territory, in Canada, and from little towns in Arizona and Mississippi, and people from the UK and from South Africa, Australia, write to me from time to time and say, thank you so much for this ministry. So I just share that with you, and now I'll take off my jacket because I'm working up a sweat. Up on the big screen today, picture of the Somerville family circa 1976. All right, last picture I showed was just me and my 2 older brothers. I'm in this picture too, and I'm over on the far left from where you're sitting. I must have been 17 and a few months, getting ready to go off to college at St. Andrew's Presbyterian College, Laurinburg, North Carolina. My brother Ed is on the opposite side, and he went with me to St. Andrews. He's the oldest and the only blonde in the whole family. We kind of wondered where he came from. Next to him is my brother Scott, who was one of the three wise men yesterday. And down below them, Greg, who is just younger than me. Gray, Robert Gray, the other brother over here, who looks like Greg's twin. And in fact, Greg and Gray, some people think they were twins. They weren't. That little baby crying in the picture, my little brother Billy, 17 years younger than me, now a clinical psychologist living and working in New York City. How they grow up. And then, of course, my mom and dad, Jim and Mary Rice Whiting Somerville. We called her Ricey. I mean, people called her Ricey. We called her Mom. But there she is, still smiling after 6 boys. Wow. Okay, you're going to hear a little more about them today. We're talking about growing up and holding on to a Christian faith, which is probably harder these days than it's ever been. How can you be a passionate believer in times like these? How is it possible to hold on to your faith? Well, I believe that your faith has to grow right along with you. It has to change. It probably goes through a few crises along the way, but you can come out on the other side of that an even stronger believer than you were before. I can't remember who said it, but somebody said, I wouldn't give anything for, like faith on the other side of crisis, but I would give everything for faith on this side. Like faith that has come through that proving ground and emerged on the other side stronger than ever is the kind of faith you want to have. You want to have a grown-up faith. So I've been sharing my story in the same way Marcus Borg shares his story in this little book, Convictions. He talks about his memories, childhood memories of religious faith. He talks about his conversions, and he uses that in the plural form to talk about the struggles that he went through in youth and young adulthood to get to the place he eventually came to. And that's the place of conviction. The book is called Convictions, and he talks about how he arrived at a place where he can believe passionately those things he believes. That's where I want you to be. That's where I want to be. If I'm going to believe anything, I want to believe it passionately, right? Not half-heartedly. So how do you get there from childhood, from that time when you're standing out in the yard like one of the 3 wise men looking toward the Star of Bethlehem? That's where we were yesterday. Today, we're going to continue this journey. And again, I want you to be thinking about these 4 Latin words for faith. Assensus, right, which is giving your intellectual assent to theological propositions. Fiducia, which is radical trust. Fidelitas, which is faithfulness to God. And then visio, which is a way of seeing reality. So today we're going to be talking probably more about fidelitas, about faithfulness to God. And maybe you can hear that in this story. When we left off yesterday, I was leaving Wise, Virginia, the only home I had ever known. Was in the way back part of the station wagon watching the raindrops slide down the glass as the tears slid down my cheeks. Was leaving behind my best friend, Bobby Thompson, leaving behind that home that had been my only home, and heading off into the darkness to a life unknown. We ended up in my grandmother's unheated summer cottage in Blowing Rock, North Carolina, in late December. And it was cold. Some of you may remember that back in your childhood, it used to actually get cold in the wintertime. Do you remember? This was cold. It was Blowing Rock, North Carolina, up in the higher elevations, in the mountains, and that cabin was unheated, as I said, uninsulated. My father would get up early in the morning and build a big fire in the stone fireplace, and once it was roaring, he would call us down from this upstairs loft where we were sleeping. there was a brass fire pole that went from the loft to the main level. And my brother Scott, who's over there with the glasses, he would jump out of bed in just his BVDs, leap out the little door of the loft onto that brass fire pole and go squeaking all the way down. Squeak, 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 skin against cold brass. But then he would go over in front of the fire, and my dad was the one who would wake us up. He banged a wooden block against that brass fire pole, and he would say, "This is the day the Lord has made." Clang, 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 clang. And we were supposed to say, right, "Let us be glad and rejoice in it." Scott was the only one who was rejoicing. Ed and I would just roll over and groan, but eventually get up and walk the mile to the bus stop so that we could go to Blowing Rock Elementary School, where I was in 3rd grade with a teacher named Miss Holler. Holler, I say. My previous teacher had been Miss Hubbard, and I was in love with Miss Hubbard, but there was Miss Holler, who I did not love, and she didn't seem to love me. But we made it through about 3 months in Blowing Rock. What I didn't realize at the time is that we were living there because my dad was unemployed. I thought it was a choice that he had made. Let's all go vacation in an unheated cabin in the wintertime. He was unemployed. He was looking for work the whole time we were there. He was looking, and finally found a job with something called the West Virginia Mountain Project, sponsored by the Presbyterian Church, trying to end poverty in Boone County, West Virginia, one of the 20 poorest counties in the nation at that time. The other thing I didn't know is that my dad had agreed to go to work for the West Virginia Mountain Project for what would be the pay you would receive at the poverty level for a family of his size. So he took what amounted to a vow of poverty to go work among poor people in West Virginia as a poor person living in West Virginia, kind of an incarnational ministry. I was too young to understand any of that. I was 6. But I know that we moved from Blowing Rock to Boone County, West Virginia, into this big old house that was the headquarters of the West Virginia Mountain Project. And I went to school at Pettus Elementary School, just down the road, where I was in 3rd grade for the 3rd time that year. Miss Govey. And Miss Govey would make us stand up every morning and say the pledge to the flag, which we did. I knew that already. And then we had to sing this song about West Virginia. I just need you to know, I was grieving the whole idea of moving away from Virginia, my home. And so to come to this new state, West Virginia, where we had to sing the West Virginia state song, was not something I was happy about. She would stand up there and make us sing. "Oh, those West Virginia hills, how majestic and how grand, with their summits bathed in glory like the Prince Emmanuel's land. Is it any wonder then that my heart with rapture thrills, as I stand once more with loved ones on those West Virginia hills?" And then there was a chorus. "Oh, those hills, beautiful hills, how I love those West Virginia hills. If o'er land or sea I roam, still I think of happy home and my friends among those West Virginia hills." I hated that song. I hated living in West Virginia. There were these 2 boys in the class, twins, who kept saying, "West Virginia is the best Virginia," and I would say, "No, it's not. I wouldn't bring my dog to West Virginia." But I had to live there. I had to go to school there. I had to put up with that kind of attitude until the 4th grade. And we moved up the river to a place called Seth, West Virginia, and I was in 4th grade with Mrs. Bowen, my teacher. And there was a little girl in that class that I noticed. I had never noticed little girls before. But this little girl walked in, And I looked at her and thought, what is that? What light from yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Bama Donahue is the sun. She was the little girl who sat there just like 2 seats up and 1 row over so that I could see her from 3/4 view, eyelashes like Bambi's mother, just beautiful. And one day she sat beside me on the bus on the way home, and she had told everybody she was going to sit beside Jimmy Somerville on the bus. So when she did, it got everybody's attention. She was laughing with embarrassment the whole time that we went down the road, and I was just sitting there trying to look cool at 7 years old, maybe 8. We got to my stop, and I got off, and I walked down the little path and started across the river bottom. No, it wasn't a river bottom. They called it the bottom land toward the house up on the hill. But I noticed on that day that the sky was unusually blue, and the clouds were a fleecy white, and all around that little bottom land there were these hills, these West Virginia hills. They were so majestic and so grand, with their summits bathed in glory. I mean, the lesson I learned from that is that love changes everything, right? Changed my attitude about West Virginia just to be in love with Bama Donahue. In 5th grade, I had Mr. Kirk, and at that time in history, Mr. Kirk could get away with reading us a full chapter out of the Bible every morning, which he did, and then teaching us to sing On the Wings of a Snow White Dove. Do you know that one? Anybody heard that one? On the wings of a snow white dove, God send down his pure, sweet love. I'm singing like Mr. Kirk. Sent down from above on the wings of a dove. That's how he would sing. But there we were in public school singing about the wings of a dove and hearing from the Bible day after day. That's just how it was at that time in history. Well, I went to another 6th grade as my parents moved to another house up the river. And at the end of that year, the principal came in and told everybody, Jimmy Somerville is not going to 7th grade. And they all gasped and felt sorry for me until he said, we're going to send him on to 8th grade. And that's what they did. And I was in 8th grade for about half a year when I got some kind of mysterious illness, or pretended to have a mysterious illness, so that I was able to stay out for the second half of my 8th grade year. By this time, I had skipped 2 grades, and I was about 2 feet shorter than everybody in my class. And my mother thought it might do me some good to stay home for a while and grow up right before I went off to high school the next year. So there I was at home, 12 years old, and this is when my crises of faith began to occur. So I want to walk you through 4 different kinds of crises. One was physical, one was spiritual, one was intellectual, one was emotional. Buckle your pew belts. The first one was physical. I was 12 years old. I was about that age when everything begins to change. And the way I noticed the change was that I was looking through the Sears and Roebuck catalog one day, which my mother had left out on the table, the kitchen table. Just looking through there, looking at the bicycles, as I always did, but I flipped a few more pages, and there I was in the women's undergarments section. And here were models who were wearing industrial strength undergarments, and I found myself strangely fascinated and kept looking at those pages. And This had never happened to me before. I had never found that part of the wish book interesting. But there I was when my mother came in the back door, and I quickly turned to the bicycle section. And that was a feeling I'd never had before. To be doing something that I didn't want my mother to know about, or if I had had it before, I didn't remember. But I remember this. I was in the wrong section of the Sears Roebuck catalog, and I was turning pages quickly. I began to have thoughts and feelings that I had never had before, and I was ashamed of them. And I wondered how I could keep my parents from finding out that I was having these thoughts and feelings, because I was having thoughts and feelings that a good Christian boy should not have. And I had always thought of myself as a good Christian boy. It was a little bit of a crisis for me. I went off to high school the next year at the age of 13, and there was Susan Pullins, and that did not help. I just began to have more thoughts and feelings than I had ever had before, and I didn't know how to keep them a secret. At Christmas of that year, my two older brothers came home from prep school, and my brother Scott, who's over there again with the glasses, was invited by some neighbors to go to their church. And he did go to their church, and that led to something I would call a spiritual crisis. He came home from that church late that night, probably after midnight. It had been some kind of revival service in the evening. And he came in talking in this high-pitched language that I had never heard before, and talking really fast. And my mother got up and helped him get a basin of water so he could wash his feet. This is a whole different story, but we were living in a house that didn't have running water. And so we had to heat water on the stove, and this is how we would get ready for bed at night. We would wash off with a washcloth, wash our feet before we stuck them between the sheets. My brother Scott was in the kitchen washing his feet, but he was whooping and shouting and talking in this strange high-pitched language. And when my brother Ed and I came down the stairs, we saw him sitting there. Every once in a while, his feet would fly out of that wash basin, and water would splash all over the kitchen floor. And my mother had pulled up a chair, and she was listening to him and trying to make sense of what had happened. Well, some of you may know it was a Pentecostal church. My brother had been filled with the Holy Ghost, and he came home speaking in tongues. Ed and I had never heard of this before. We hadn't seen it. We were good Presbyterian kids, right? But Scott kept talking like that, and finally there was a break, and Ed said to him, "Does God have a message for me?" That's Ed over there, far right. And Scott got very quiet, and then he began to speak in this tone that was very reassuring and encouraging. And he spoke for about 3 minutes, and Ed was listening, although neither of us could make sense of what Scott was saying. I was encouraged by that experience. And when Scott finished talking to Ed, I said, does God have a message for me? And Scott closed his eyes again. He got quiet. And when he began to speak, tears started trickling down his cheeks. And his voice was broken and choked with sobs. And as he talked, it sounded as if God's heart was broken because of me. That's the way I interpreted it on that night, and I excused myself and went back upstairs to my bed, and I lay there and made promises that no 13-year-old boy should ever be expected to keep. Promising God that things would be different from now on. I was going to be a good boy. I wasn't going to have any more of those, thoughts and feelings that I used to have. I was going to be, a good Christian boy. Well, I got a Bible for Christmas that year. It was one of those living Bibles. Do you remember? It had a green padded cover, and inside were words that I could read and understand. The Living Bible. I was grateful for it. I also got a set of colored felt tip pens, fine point. And like the day after Christmas, I opened that Bible right there at the kitchen table so my mother could see me reading the Bible. She had been there when Scott wept over me. And I wanted her to know that I was a good Christian. So I sat there reading that new Bible, started with the Gospel of Matthew and began to underline important verses with a blue felt tip pen. And then I got over into Mark, and I used a different color, and then Luke, and a different color there, and then John, and then I got into Acts, and then Romans, and it was in Romans that the Bible really started to speak to me. In chapter 7, Paul said, I know I am rotten through and through. So far as my old sinful nature is concerned, no matter which way I turn, I can't make myself do right. I want to, but I can't. When I want to do good, I don't, and when I try not to do wrong, I do it anyway. Now, if I am doing what I don't want to, it is plain where the trouble is. Sin still has me in its grip. I read that and thought, well, I could have written that. I could have been in the Bible if I had just written that because Paul was speaking my language. So I did the only thing I could think of to do. I asked to be baptized. Some of you know Presbyterians. You know they baptize infants, right? Not adults, not believers. Some Methodists do it that way as well. So I had been sprinkled as an infant, but here I was at the age of 13, almost 14, saying, I'd like to be baptized by immersion in the river like all my friends had been baptized. So that summer, my dad made arrangements, got in touch with one of his Baptist friends, and we had a river baptism, and I was the first one out there. Waded out into the middle of the big cold river. It was about waist deep. And my dad and his friend lowered me down into the water in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and I came up clean. On the way home, I was walking with somebody who said to me, do you feel different? And I surprised myself by saying, no. No, I don't feel the same. And the next year, I went off to prep school. There's another crisis of faith, this one intellectual. The boys I met at the Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire were smart and sophisticated. They didn't have much use for religion. I remember one of them telling me that Christianity was a crutch. There didn't seem to be room in their minds for all these new things they were learning and also those ancient stories from Scripture. For example, the one in Joshua 10, about the time the sun stood still in the sky for an hour or so. I learned things in science class that made that story seem very unlikely. I learned other things that made me wonder if the Bible was even true. Not long after that, I skipped church one Sunday. I think I was the only boy at Exeter who was going to church on Sunday, but I skipped one Sunday because I had a lot of work to do, and that made it easier to skip the next Sunday and the Sunday after that, and before you know it, I had fallen out of the church-going habit, struggling to improve my grades, which were not good, and so weary from the effort. I had an alarm clock back then, living in a single room up on the 4th floor of my dormitory, one of those electric alarm clocks that buzzes when the alarm goes off. Do you know? That really annoying buzz. I got to the point where I hated that alarm clock so much because it kept waking me up in the morning and telling me I had to go to class. Hated it so much that when it clicked, just before it buzzed, my hand would shoot out from under the covers and slap the top of it before the buzz even began. This was from a deep sleep. I hated school that much. When I came home for Thanksgiving break or whatever it was, my mom said to me, that's Mom up there with a smile on her face, she said, if you hate school so much, why don't you just apply to college early? I said, can you do that? I was in my junior year. She said, why not? Give it a try. Couldn't hurt. You could apply to that school where your uncle teaches down in North Carolina. So I did, and they accepted me. And I said goodbye to the Phillips Exeter Academy without much grief at all. This picture is in that summer just before I went off to St. Andrews. I decided I would take my brother Ed with me. He was going to West Virginia State College, which was a teacher's school. I think he was the only white person there, which he kind of enjoyed. It made him feel special. But I said, look, I don't want to be the only person in our family going off to college. Why don't you come with me? And Ed did. He transferred. He was so good about waking me up and making me come to church with him. He was an inspiration, a much better Christian than I was. I started feeling good about myself again, started running track and cross country, and then Ed graduated and left, and I had another crisis of faith. This one was emotional. In the summer after my sophomore year at St. Andrews, I worked as a counselor at a Christian camp, and I sort of fell in love with my co-counselor, who was older by 2 years and beautiful in a kind of exotic way. One night before the next group of kids arrived for summer camp, we ended up alone together in an empty bunkhouse, and I lost my virginity, which is something I had promised myself I would not do. I wanted to be a virgin on my wedding night. I had taken a vow. She was more experienced than I was. She didn't think anything of it. I did. I remember going to the bathhouse and looking in the mirror and thinking, right there is the biggest sinner who has ever lived. I don't know. Looking back, it feels different, but when you're in that moment, that's how it felt to me. I went back to school that fall, but things didn't go well. I had declared a pre-med major, which was a huge mistake. Found myself taking calculus and organic chemistry and microbiology and not doing well in any of those things. I began to show symptoms of depression. I couldn't wait to get back to my room and into my bed after classes. And in the morning, I could hardly get out. Some of the older and other pre-med students began to talk about dropping out of school and going to work on a sheep farm somewhere. Wouldn't that be nice? Yes, I thought that would be nice. They kept talking about it, but I was the one who actually did it. In the spring of that year, the spring semester, I went to the high mountains of eastern West Virginia, Pocahontas County, where I got a job working for a farmer about a mile away from where my brother Ed was living and working, teaching school. And Ed was a good influence, you remember. He was a good influence. So was the work on the farm. It kept me busy, kept me out of trouble, gave me plenty of time to think about my life and what might come next. There were lots of sheep on the farm. There were also a few pigs, and there was one day when I remember feeding the pigs with this, feed corn, and picking up a kernel of it and wondering what it tasted like and chewing on it. And that's when I thought, I'm the son in that story of the prodigal son. I've ended up in the far country, feeding pigs and eating their food. It's happened to me. A few weeks later, I was in the front yard of that farmer's house. It was the spring of the year, but he hadn't raked his leaves the fall before. They were all matted and soggy, and he had asked me to see if I could get them up so that the spring grass could grow. So there I was out in the front yard with a leaf rake trying to get up these soggy leaves. In that moment, it occurred to me that the only time I had ever felt really good about myself was when I was trying to do what I thought God wanted me to do. So right there in that farmer's front yard, I closed my eyes, I leaned on that rake, and I said, Father, I have strayed so far away from you, but I want to come home. I would say that from that time until this one, I've been walking in that direction. Sometimes I've strayed off the path, right? Because sometimes you do. Sometimes I've stumbled and fallen. But there have been people who picked me up, put me back on my feet, brushed me off, helped me to keep going. People who are church people, fellow believers, people like you who have kept me going. So I'm going to stop there for now, but I want to talk about that word fidelitas, that Latin word for religion, which means faithfulness. Because in all those crises that I mentioned, I think what was happening was that I was losing my faithfulness to God. I was being pulled away from God by other things. And my love and my loyalty for God that I had felt as a boy were compromised as I began to reach out toward other things. Marcus Borg says that the biblical word for that kind of unfaithfulness is not adultery so much as idolatry. And it's all through the Old Testament, right? The people who had promised to be loyal to God found themselves lusting after other gods and going after them. So, of these four different ways of talking about faith, I had experiences that challenged my faithfulness to God. And I've tried since then to remain faithful. And that's a way of being passionate about your belief that is different from giving your intellectual assent to a list of theological propositions. It's about staying close to God and trying to stay in love with God, even when there are so many things that challenge that love. Wondering if you have questions today. I know I've mostly just been storytelling, but maybe you can talk to me about your experience or about your understanding of faith as faithfulness to God, the fidelitas word.